Hi everyone, Amichai here. In today's video, we're going to take a look at .NET MAUI. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to create this application over here completely from scratch using MVVM data binding. We're going to use the .NET Community Toolkit. We're going to create a custom converter. There's going to be a lot going on, and we're going to write a lot of code, a lot of C# code, a lot of XAML code. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a good intuition to what it's like developing in .NET MAUI, and you'll be able to take the concepts that you learned today and apply them in something completely different. Okay, now what we have on the screen is basically a project that's created from the template in Visual Studio. The only thing I changed is in the resources, I replaced the default Open Sans font with Roboto font. That's the only difference. Other than that, it's exactly the same. Now, I don't want you to be intimidated by all these folders and what's going on over here, because when we get to it, then I think you'll understand it a bit better when we break it down chunk by chunk. Okay, so what we have currently is I click play and we're running on some Android emulator. And what we have over here is basically the main page is displayed. Now, what we see here is a vertical stack layout. So the items are stacked vertically. Then in the top, we have this image, right? That's where it comes from. And in the bottom, then we have this button that simply says click me, right? That's the text over here. When we click it, then it invokes the onCounterClicked method, which is implemented over here. And we can see the actual implementation. So when we click it, then it displays the text, right? And every time we click it, then it's invoked again. And that's what we see over here. Okay, now what we have over here is an application in which you can create breakfast. So you have here a button, you click it, you put the breakfast details. Once you complete it, then you have one of these on the screen. So let's go ahead and model one of these. So for that, let's stop the application. Let's minimize this for now. And over here, let's create a new folder. Let's call it models. And inside, let's model our breakfast. So let's say breakfast.cs. Let's make this a bit more concise. Let's say public record breakfast. And let's model one of them. So string name, string description. We have the start and end daytime, right? So start daytime and end daytime. We have also a list of savory items and a list of sweet items as well, right? The only thing we're missing is the image, right? So we also have here the image. Great, let's get rid of these redundant using statements and go ahead and create the view model. So over here, let's create a new folder. It's called view models. And inside, let's create this page. Let's call it my breakfasts view model. So my breakfasts view model. And again, let's make this a bit more concise. Change this to public class my breakfast view model. And the breakfast view model is going to hold the list of breakfast that the UI is going to bind this list to this list of breakfast to present it on the screen, right? So a list of breakfasts like so, right? Let's just add the using statement. Okay, now what we want to have over here, basically this thing over here is going to be some collection view, and the source for these items is going to be this field. But in .NET MAUI, every time you make a change in the view model and you want it to be displayed in the view, again, this is the main view, the one that we're going to manipulate. So every time we want it to be reflected over there, you need to notify that a change happened. Okay, now to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to use the .NET Community Toolkit, which does a lot of the magic and the heavy lifting for us. So the way this looks, let's go to the NuGet package manager and let's look for the Community Toolkit .mvvm. This should be enough. Yes, this one over here. Let's choose our project and let's click install. Then what we can do is we can implement the observable object and let's add it. Again, this comes from the Community Toolkit. And what this does is a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So what we can do is simply say over here that this is an observable property, and behind the scenes, it'll auto-generate. There's a source generator that builds the public property for us, that every time we make changes to that public property, then it knows to notify that there are changes. And the way this works is that if you would want to implement it yourself, then you would have to implement the iNotify property change. And then every time that you update that property, then you would have to notify basically the view that it changed. But what we can do is we can simply add this, and the source generator will do everything for us. We're going to take a look into it a bit deeper in a few minutes. The only thing we need to do for now is say partial, right? That's what it's complaining about, because the public property is going to be in the other partial part of the class. Okay, let's add here a constructor. So let's say my breakfast view model, and here let's populate this list of breakfast with some mock data. So let's say load breakfasts, and let's generate this method. And for now, let's simply say breakfasts equals new, and over here let's put some fake data. Now notice that what we're updating is breakfast with a capital B. Now we didn't define it, it was defined by this attribute over here. And if we look at the implementation, then like we said, this is in the other partial part of this class, and we can see that the get is simply getting this thing over here. But when we set it, then we need to do what we talked about before, call on property changing, on property changed, which is how the view knows that the value changed. And what we care about happens over here, where we actually set the backing field to the value that we define. Okay, every time we want our changes to notify the view, then we want to update the public auto-generated property. Okay, I'm pasting in some mock information which corresponds to the UI we have over here, right? So vegan sunshine, or I don't know, the list of sweet items corresponds to this, and so on. This is just so the UI that we're working on will look exactly like the mock. Okay, what we want to do is we want to put a semicolon over here, and that's it for this file. Again, let's just get rid of the redundant using statements. And the next thing we want to do is we want to go to the main page, and we want to define the binding context. Okay, so soon we're going to look into data binding, and we're going to see what it looks like from the view point of view. And what we're going to do is we're going to take many of the properties and we're going to bind them to some data that sits in the view model. But for this connection to exist, we need to define in the main page what the binding context is. So in our case, what we can do, there are multiple ways to do this. This is just one example, is to say that over here, the binding context is our view model. So let's say my breakfasts view model. Let's just include the namespace, and that's it. So let's run the application, and we're going to see how fun it is with hot reload to simply write what we want and see the changes reflected in real time. Okay, so the application launched, and we still have the exact same thing like before. That's because we didn't change anything yet. Now what we want to do is we want to actually do the data binding, start working on the view to make it look like the mock that we have. So the first thing I want to do is basically get rid of this entire thing. So let's delete it, and you can see that right away it disappears. That's because we have hot reload, so we can see what this actually looks like. Okay, so now after we deleted this, then we can also delete this method. We don't need it anymore. And now let's start modeling what we have over here. So basically what we have is the following. This top part, this is probably something that should sit over here, right? So let's ignore it as part of this page because this is something global for the entire application. What we have over here, we can look at it as a grid that has 4 rows, right? So this is the first row, this is the second row, this entire thing is the third row, and this part over here is the fourth row. So for that, let's go ahead and create a grid, and let's define how each one of these rows is going to look. So the way you do that is you create a row definitions property, which inside will have the row definitions, and here we can define the height of each one of them. Okay, so putting over here auto basically means however much space the line needs, it'll get. So for example, if this font size is 16, then it'll get some amount of space, but if it's 100, then it'll need more space. Okay, that's auto. And we can see that basically these two need as much space as they need. Same goes for the button. But for our scrollable list of dinners, we want to catch all the rest of the screen, right? So what we can do is we can create here 4 row definitions, and for the third one, let's put a star. Now something cool that you could do is also say over here 2 stars, for example, and then the remaining space will be divided between these 2 lines in the ratio that you define. Okay, now what we have over here, so the first line is your breakfasts, right? The next line is breakfasts you have created. The third one is a scrollable list of breakfasts, right? So scrollable list of breakfasts. And the last one is the create new breakfast button, right? Okay, let's start with your breakfast. So what we have over here is actually two items. So let's create over here a horizontal stack layout, and inside let's create our two labels where the text on the first one is your and the text on the second one is breakfasts. Now it's pretty cool that we have hot reload. We can see the changes be reflected immediately. Now the font size is a bit bigger. If I remember correctly, it's 24. Let's see if that looks right. Yeah, looks about right. The font family is Roboto Bold. And what else do we have here? Maybe the padding of the entire thing is something like this. Yeah, this seems about right. And the last thing we want to do is we want to update the color, right? So let's define the text color to be this thing over here. So let's pick this color. It's the same color for both of them. And let's paste it over here. Great, that looks better. What we might want to do if this color appears in many places in our application is to define it as a static resource over here. So we can go to the colors XAML, and what this is a resource dictionary. And we can define here a new resource, call it, let's say, Boober Blue, and paste the color that we want over there, right? So let's try picking it again, pasting it over here. And I think I missed before, so the new one seems a bit better. Let's say static resource and Boober Blue. Okay, so that looks right. Let's move on to breakfasts you have created. So let's say over here, label, the text of this thing is breakfasts you have created. Okay, now by default, it goes to row 0 and column 0 in the grid, but we want it in row number 1. So let's do grid.row1. We can say that the text color is gray, let's say something like this. See, that looks right. Yeah, looks about right. The last thing we want to do is create the create new breakfast button before we move on to the scrollable list of dinners. So let's create here a button. Let's say that the text is create new breakfast. We want the background color to be black. This thing, yes. We want the padding to be a bit more, right? Let's say 16, and maybe the corner radius is a bit less round. Let's say 2. Let's see what that looks like. Great, and let's put on the correct column. So grid.row number 3, and this puts it in the bottom. Now, like we said before, if we put it on number 2, then it'll catch all the space that it can. But for our case, we want it to be in row number 3. Okay, now let's move on to this part over here. What we want to do is we want to bind the information that we have in the view model to this scrollable list of breakfasts. So what we want to do is create over here a collection view and define what the source of the items is. So what we want to do is we want to say items source and bind it to the list of breakfasts. Okay, now it would be great if I would write here breakfast and I would have autocomplete. So what we want to do is we want to go up here and XMLNS stands for XML namespace. So let's simply copy this entire thing and let's give it a name. Let's call it view models. And if you write view model, then for you, I'm guessing it's too small to see, but it's the namespace of the view models. So if we click it, then it fills it with the correct information. And now what we can do is we can say that the data type is the my breakfasts view model. Okay, so again, this thing over here is the namespace that we defined, and we're saying that the hint for the data type comes from the my breakfast view model class. Okay, so what we can do now is we can go back to here and we should have IntelliSense. So let's say breakfast, and we can see that we have here IntelliSense for the property. Okay, great. So we binded it and we can see that it already appears. So this is the information that we put in the view model. I think it's simply to string on the values. So let's put it first in the right grid row. So let's say grid.row2. That takes it to the second row in the grid. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to fix the spacing. So currently the two items are one next to each other, but we can see that over here there's a bit of spacing. So to find out what the spacing is, if you're working with Figma, then all you need to do is hold down Alt and see what its distance is from the different item. Now for you it's probably too small to see, but it says 19.98. That's because I'm not a designer. This was supposed to be 20. So let's add that spacing. Let's say collection view dot items layout, and over here let's define a linear item layout, and let's say that the orientation is vertical and that the item spacing is 20. Okay, the next thing we want to do is define each one of the items what its layout is. So the way we can do that is we can say collection view dot item template, and over here define how each one of them is going to look. But because we have data binding, then we need to put this inside a data template. And now we can see that for each one of these items, then it has a little border. So for that, let's create here border, and let's say that the minimum size of it is, we can see that even though it's not filling all the information, it still has some minimum height. So around 315. So let's say here minimum height is 315, like so. That looks a bit better. Also, maybe the line isn't as thick, so let's say that the stroke is, I don't know, let's say dark gray again. See what it looks like. No, that doesn't look good. Let's say light gray. Yeah, that seems about right. Okay, the next thing we want to do is define each one of the items inside. So basically what we have here are two columns, right? Where this column is about twice the width of this column. So we already know how to do that. What we want to do over here is create a grid. And inside here, let's define our column definitions. So for the first column, the width is simply star. And for the second one, it's 2 stars. Now let's define the image. So the image sits on the first column. So let's say that the source of this image is binding to the image property in the breakfast. Now we don't have IntelliSense, and that's because we haven't defined what type we're using over here in the data template. So what we want to do is we want to say data type and put here the breakfast, but breakfast isn't recognized, and that's because we only put the namespace of the view model and not of the models. So for that, all we need to do is duplicate this line, change this to models, and over here put the correct namespace for the models. And now we should have IntelliSense. So let's try writing breakfast, and it auto completes, and again it comes from the models namespace. Now it knows that each one of the items here is from the breakfast type. So we can even navigate to definition, and it takes us to the correct property. Okay, so we put the image. Let's put a closing tag so it appears in the UI. Great, looks better. We want to fix the aspect. So let's say aspect is aspect fill, and seems about right. Okay, for the next one, what we want to do is we want to have the breakfast details, right? So let's make this a bit more readable. Let's put this on top. So we can look at this as a grid where we basically have 5 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where the third row basically catches as much space as it can. So we know how to do that already. So let's say grid, and this grid sits in the first column, right? This part over here. And what we have inside are 5 rows. So let's say row definition, and let's say that the height is auto for all of them other than the third one, which is the description, and it's basically as much space as it can catch. Okay, so again, just to recap, we have over here a grid. This grid has 2 columns. The first column has the image, which is this, and the second column over here has this grid, which is these details over here. Okay, now for the breakfast details, the first thing we have is the name, then we have the start and end daytime. The third thing we have is the description, and then we have 2 lists, the list of savory items and the list of sweet items. So for the name, this is simple. We already know how to do it. So the text is simply binding to the name. Great. And again, we have here some padding, right? Let's see how much it is. Around 16. Yeah. Again, I'm not a designer, so that's how much it came out to be. So let's say a padding of around 16. Let's say that the font is a bit bigger. Let's say the font size is 24. The font family is Roboto Bold. And that's it. Okay, for the start and end time, for now, let's just put here a placeholder. Okay, we're going to update it soon using a converter. This is, if you notice, the only property that's not a one-to-one mapping between the information to what's displayed on the screen. So for now, let's simply say, I don't know, this string over here, right? Let's copy it and paste it over here, just a placeholder. For now, let's say that the font is 16. It sits on the second row, right? So grid.row 1. The font is not Roboto Bold. Okay, next we have the description. So over here we have a label. The binding is to the description. And this sits in the third row, so 2. And it has a bit of a padding on top, right? So let's say padding, let's say 8 to the top. The text is a bit lighter. Let's say that the text color is, again, dark gray. So like so. Okay, so it's starting to look better, and it's really cool to be developing something like this so fluently without reload, especially when we're building it for Android, but with some tweaks, it'll look very similar on iOS as well. Okay, the next thing we have are the savory items and the sweet items. So what we want to do is we have a list of strings. We want to display it like so. And if it is too long, then we want it to be wrapped and move to the next line. So for that, we can use a flex layout. So let's say here a flex layout where we want to define that the item source is the savory list, right? So let's put this on a little line so we can see what it says. And let's say binding to the savory. Let's make here a bit more room. Also, let's move it to the correct row. So let's say that the row is number 3. And for us to be able to see something, let's say that align items to the start. Great. Also, let's say wrap is wrap. By default, it's no wrap. And that's why we can't see what's off the screen. Great. Now we want to define each one of them, what it looks like. So again, we're familiar with something similar to this. So bindable layout dot item template. And because we have data binding, then again, this sits inside a data template. And what we want to define is each one of these. So let's say label, and the text is binding to simply our information, which is simply dot, right? Now we want to define the color, but if you look, then you can see that there's a bit of a radius, and labels don't have a corner radius property. So what we want to do is we want to put this entire thing inside a frame. So let's say frame, and let's put the label inside. And now let's define this. So let's say that the padding inside is less, let's say 6, and see what it looks like. Yes, that looks good. Great. For the margin, let's say 2 or 1. Yeah, that looks better. For the border, let's say that it's transparent. And for the background, this is the reason why we did this entire thing. Let's say that the color is this thing. Let's see if I can catch it. And great, that looks good. Now what we need to do is take this entire thing, paste it over here in the suite. Let's change the row to 4. Let's say that the background color is this pinkish color. And let's bind it to the suite items. Great, that looks about right. Let's put one next to each other and see what it looks like. Yes, so this looks pretty good, right? Maybe the only thing that we're missing is that here there's padding and here there isn't. So let's go up here and let's add here some margin. Let's say that the margin on the top and the bottom is 8, right? Something like this. Let's see what it looks like. Maybe even more. Let's say 16. Yes, that looks better. And what else? Yeah, that looks good. Okay, we said that we want to pull for refresh. So what we can do is we can take this entire thing, minimize it, and then we can, let's get rid of this for now. And we can put this entire thing inside a refresh view. And let's move this inside, fix the indentation, and let's move these properties to the refresh view now. Great, let's just fix the indentation. Okay, so we did this, and now when we pull it down, then we can see that we have the refresh. Now again, this is for Android, so this is the widget that is used, but we expect the correct widget to be used depending on the platform. Okay, but it's loading forever, and that's because we need to set some other things as well. So if we look at the property is refresh and we change it to false, then we can see that it disappears, right? And true makes it appear again. So what we want to have over here is basically a binding to some is refreshing property that we're going to define soon. When we're finished refreshing, then we'll set it to false and it'll disappear. And the last thing we want to do is to define some command that when we pull it down like this, then it invokes this command and we can act, right? So what we want to do over here is binding to some, let's call it load breakfasts command, right? Okay, now let's go ahead and define these two things. And I'm reminding you that we still have the time hard-coded. We want to replace this with dynamic text. Okay, so that's what we have left. Let's go ahead and implement it. So back in the view model, we already have our load breakfasts. What we can do is we can change this to public, and we can put on this entire thing the relay command attribute. And what this does, let me stop the application because hot reload doesn't work in this case. What this is going to do is it's going to auto-generate the code needed to basically wire the things together. So we're going to take a look at the generated code in a few minutes. But for now, let's simply have this, let's say load breakfasts async, and let's make this async task. And just to feel like something asynchronous is happening, let's say await task.delay, and let's say, for example, 2 seconds, right? Something like this. Okay, the last thing we still need to do is put this entire thing inside a try finally block, where in the finally, what we'll do is we'll set that is refreshing to false, right? So that's two things that we still need to do. So let's go to the top over here, and let's say try, and in the end, let's say finally, and here we'll have that is refreshing false, right? Where we still need to define this. Let's just move this entire thing inside the block and fix the indentation. Great, and to create this property, then we already know how to do that. All we need to do is go over here and define here is refreshing field, and it'll auto-generate the public property that will notify the view for us. Okay, let's rerun the application. Hope we didn't make any mistakes, and let's recap in the meantime. So what we have is we have the breakfast, which models one of the items on the breakfast list. Then we have our view model. The view model simply has two properties. One is the list of breakfasts that the view is using to create this scrollable list over here. Then we have the is refreshing property. This is the property that we want to change to control whether or not the loading widget will appear or not. And what we have over here is the load breakfast async, where we're simply putting static information and we're waiting 2 seconds to simulate as if something asynchronous is happening. Then in our XAML, then we defined everything. We have over here the refresh view, which wraps this entire list. And now if this worked, so when we pull it down, then it invokes the load breakfast command. It waits 2 seconds. It changes the is refreshing to false, and then it disappears. Okay, the last thing we still need to do is we need to change this start and end daytime to be dynamic based on the information, right? So if it's today, then it'll say today. If it's tomorrow, it'll say tomorrow. But if it's a different date altogether, then according to our mock, then it will simply show the day of the week and then the date, right? So we need to do that depending on the information. So we want to use a converter for that. So the first thing we want to do, let's stop the application, is add another NuGet package. So the package we want to add is the community toolkit.maui. So simply click it and select install. We can move this for now. Okay, now that we have that, let's go ahead and create our two converters. So back in the Solution Explorer, let's create here the converters folder, which inside will have two converters. The first one is we want to convert the start daytime to the breakfast day, right? Today, tomorrow, or some date. So let's call it daytime to breakfast day converter, right? Let's say something like that. Okay, and what we have over here is we're inheriting from the base converter, and we're converting from an object to a string. Okay, implementing the abstract class, then we have the following. Okay, so basically what we have is a converter that we can now use in our XAML code. And when we pass any value, then this method over here is invoked, and whatever we pass in the value will be for us to manipulate. And whatever we return from this method is the string that the view is actually going to get and be able to use. So in our case over here, this is going to be the start daytime. And what we're going to want to return is today, tomorrow, or some date. So for that, let's do something simple for now. Let's say daytime equals, and let's convert the value to a daytime. So yes. Then what we want to do is we want to see how many days away it is from today. All right. So for that, what we can do is the following. We can say daytime dot date. This returns the date part of the daytime, and we can do minus daytime dot today, which is today. And then we can say how many days do we have here in total, and we can switch on this value, and we can say, okay, if it's 0 days, then simply return today. If it's 1 day, then return tomorrow. Okay, and for the last one, then what we want is this format where we basically have the day of the week and then a comma and then the day in the month and then a dot and then the month, right? Not the best decision, but again, I'm not a designer. So let's say we have something like this. Here we have a comma, then a space, then a dot, and what we have is the daytime dot day of week, right? Then over here we have the daytime dot day and month, and the last one is the month. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so this converter that we now defined gives us only this section, right, up until this comma. But we still have this part where basically we have the time part of the start date time and the time part of the end date time with a dash between them. So to do that, let's go to our converters folder and let's create here a new converter. Let's call it daytime to, let's say, I don't know, time converter, right? Something like this. Then what we want is going to be similar. So again, we need to inherit from the base converter. This receives an object and returns a string. Let's implement it. So what we can do is we can say that the daytime, again, let's cast the value to a daytime, and then we can say return, and then we can say time only from daytime, pass it the date time, and take only the short time string, which will give us what we want, and that should be it. Okay, so we have our two converters defined right over here. What we want to do now is add them to the static resource dictionary and then invoke them on the correct parameters in the view and manipulate the UI to look like in our mock. So the first thing we want to do is go to the styles and define it over here in the resource dictionary. So let's add the namespace of the converters. We already know the drill. Let's give it the name converters, and over here, let's say converters, and let's add our entry. So we have converters and the name of our converter, and let's give it a name. Let's say this thing. Then let's do the same thing for the second converter, and let's give it also the same name. Now there's one more thing that we want to do because we're using the .NET MAUI community toolkit. We want to go to the MAUI program And if you worked with ASP.NET, then this looks familiar. If not, then don't worry. All you need to do is add over here the Use MAUI Community Toolkit. And that's it. Now what we can do back in our main page XAML, let's click play and use hard reload to manipulate the view to look like in the UI. Okay, so I opened our mock UI over here on the right. This over here is what we care about. And this is our actual application with the hard-coded property at the moment. Let's go ahead and use our converters. So this entire thing is like a horizontal stack layout, right? But because if it's too long, we want it to wrap, let's use a flex layout like we're already familiar with. Let's say that wrap is wrap. This also sits on row number 1. And again, let's say here align items to the start. Okay, now inside here, what we want to do is we want to have a few labels. The first label is going to be this section over here or until here, depending on the value. So the text is binding to the start datetime, and we want to use here a converter. So the converter we want to use is a static resource, and it's this one that we defined over here. Let's simply copy this value and paste it over here. And let's put a closing bracket so we can see something. And we can see already that it is dynamically populated with the right value using our converter. Maybe this is a bit small. Let me try to make this a bit bigger. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to put a comma. So we can simply say label and the text is a comma. Great. Then we want to use the second converter that we created twice, one time for the start date time and one time for the end date time. So let's simply copy this entire thing, and instead of this converter, let's use our second converter. So I pasted the value of the second converter. We see we're missing here a space, and the next thing we want is to put a dash, maybe a space between them, and then use the converter again, this time on the end date time. Okay, and great, that's it. It looks good in my opinion, very similar to the mock that we wanted to have. The only thing we didn't do is update this part to be like in our mock, but that's something that I'm leaving for you as homework. So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and you learned some new tricks and you got a feeling of what it's like to develop in .NET MAUI. If you like this video, make sure to smash that like button and I'll see you in the next one.